Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining the discussion today. I know there's a huge amount of demands on your time at the moment, so really appreciative of you taking the time to be here. Should just also, kind of as Loic said, we're all sort of experimenting in this way of working, and I apologise in advance if any one of my three children appear on the screen. I'm perched upstairs in my bedroom in a corner, trying to let them get on with life downstairs, like so many of us are at the moment. So the first thing I wanted to say is that I hope you're all well and looking after yourself. For obvious reasons, lots of people are living with different challenges in their lives at the moment, and I hope wherever you are, you're managing in these strange circumstances. And secondly, before we go any further, I wanted to call out the tremendous contribution that teachers and school leaders across the country have been providing to society at the moment. In the space of a week, in response to the challenge that coronavirus has presented us with, schools have been repurposed, and teachers and school leaders have managed to be part of a pivot of the education system on a scale that we've never seen before, and in the face of huge adversity. And frankly, I'm in awe of the work that colleagues are doing up and down the country at the moment. And if ever there's an advert for the profession and for us to be proud of the roles that our schools play as civic institutions, I think this is it. But for those who don't know me, I'm Tom Rees. I'm Exec Director of School Leadership at Ambition Institute. Before that, I was a primary head teacher for 10 years, and I was Education Director of a multi-academy trust up here in Northamptonshire, where it's very sunny today. And myself and colleagues at Ambition are really pleased to be working with Loic and colleagues at the Centre for Education and Youth on what we think is a really important piece of work at the moment. So we're here today to take part in a cross-sector conversation, specifically to consider how we can support our most vulnerable young people through the challenges that coronavirus presents. Tackling disadvantage in education was already a persistent and difficult challenge for us, and coronavirus has just made it even harder. I started talking with Loic about a fortnight ago as the reality started to dawn on us that life could be very different, and life in schools could be very different. Incidentally, that weekend I was on a NPQH weekend along with 70 hopefully future head teachers, and the sort of conversations over those 2 days really unfolded as things changed, and lots of uncomfortable questions started to get into the discussion. And in the last fortnight, so much has changed. I'm sure that you, like me and everyone else on this call, has had lots of conversations with different people at the moment who are trying to make sense of what these implications are for us all. For the last 2 evenings, I've been in trustee meetings of 2 different multi-academy trusts where I'm a non-exec director. These are really difficult meetings to the ones we normally have. Firstly, in their format, so we were all at home on Zoom calls rather than face-to-face. But secondly, in terms of the focus of the conversation, we heard about a huge amount of work that's been going on in the schools and in the trusts already in response to the kind of short-term challenges. But also that the colleagues within the trusts are now starting to grapple with what happens next. What does the summer term look like? When might schools reopen? And when they do, what are the challenges that are going to emerge that they want to start planning about and thinking about? What does a curriculum look like in the summer term? And what should be the role and the expectation of staff within those schools during that time? And there were 3 kind of examples I thought I should just share. The first was from an education director who I heard from this week, who's really concerned about that their best efforts with good intentions to promote online learning might increase the gap in educational outcomes between children. They're really concerned about the access that some children have at home to online learning. They're also really open about how they don't know much about online learning and how to do it very well, and kind of grappling with this challenge of how much pressure they feel it's appropriate to put on parents at home with homeschooling at the moment. The second is obviously about safeguarding. There are so many questions at the moment about safeguarding concerns, how they might manifest in different ways or increased ways due to lots more living in close proximity, and potentially lots of changes due to things like unemployment, care responsibilities and self-isolation in the times ahead. And finally, really uncomfortable topic is bereavement. And this is something that schools already find really difficult. I remember as a young head teacher, it was the thing that really affected me the most, was dealing with either staff bereavements or families where there was bereavement, or in some cases with children in school. And there's a real kind of uncomfortable question about what the scale of that's likely to be, how that might impact us across society, and particularly in schools, and how we might be able to support schools to deal with those circumstances in a way that's helpful. So these challenges were already difficult ones for schools, but obviously they've become further magnified within the current context. And there's so many questions about what might happen in the months ahead. And so in today's conversation, we're lucky to be joined by lots of people with different experience and expertise in the sector. We've got serving teachers, school leaders on the call today who we'll hear from. And we also think it's really important that we connect the sector at this time and bring into the conversation lots of people from other parts of the system, so we can work together in collaboration and come to better decisions and answers. So some quick final points before I hand over to Loic. First of all, some of the subject matter might be difficult, but we think it's important to explore it carefully and professionally. So if people are kind of using social media, for example, do ask that you use it generously, and we hope that we don't sensationalize what are important discussion points. Secondly, want to just recognise the difficult position that everyone finds themselves in at the moment, whether you're in government, a local authority, a school, or a parent at home. Lots of people are making decisions without sufficient time or information, but I think with good intentions. And it undoubtedly will all make mistakes and misstep, and we should be kind to each other and ourselves in this context. Thirdly, individually, no one has the answer at the moment to lots of these questions, and so we think it's important to continue this type of collaborative working that we're seeing across the sector, bringing in lots of different perspectives and voices. And finally, it feels like this is still the beginning of what's likely to be a longer term challenge. And we hope that this is a forward facing and solution focused conversation to work out how we can best support schools and colleagues in this new normal. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to hand back to Loic and we'll get into the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. That's much appreciated, and great that you're able to draw on such a mix of experience, both in terms of your roles in the MATs and in your professional role at Ambition. I'm now going to turn to Eleanor, who's been grappling with all sorts of challenges in this space recently, to set out some of the issues and approaches that she's taking in her role. So, for a couple of minutes, please.
Thanks, Loic. So I'm Eleanor Bernardes. I'm Head of Development and Opportunities at Aspire Alternative Provision Multi-Academy Trust down in Buckinghamshire. So there's a couple of things I wanted to cover. I think the first one is, for me, the answer to a lot of the problems that we've been trying to solve around looking after vulnerable young people and also key workers' children. The current, or the existing structure of the school is not naturally set up to do that. And that actually trying to readapt and trying to get school structures to fit that, to answer that problem, will only get us so far. And so that's one of the biggest problems that I've seen. And in some ways, trying to encourage us to be more radical about thinking about collaboration and partnership working we could look at in ways to really kind of pool resources to kind of answer some of these challenges. So I think for me as well, one of the really important things is actually, yes, we all care about what's going to happen to these students during this period, but that we also need to make sure we're looking after the workforce. And there is that, the famous metaphor about making sure you put your own oxygen mask on first. And for me, this is something that I see as really important, because actually the young people we're responsible for can only continue to be looked after if we make sure that we're maintaining the well-being of the workforce. And within that, we need to keep in mind that actually people are scared, and that's natural. And we need to be responding to that in ways that accept that as well. So there's been lots of people talking about different approaches and heads making their staff go in and not going in, and trying to cast judgment throughout the week on different things that different people are doing. And what I would really call for everyone to reflect on is that actually everybody is doing the best they can at this time. based on the incomplete picture that they have in front of them. And we have to approach everyone's kind of plans and viewpoint from that perspective. So when we see people responding in a way that's not in line with our own thinking, I think it takes me back a lot to, we work with our students and with our staff around the CHIMP model of mind management. You might have seen it, but that idea that actually when you're pushed into a zone where you're not comfortable, you're exhibiting behaviors which really are just the things that are the kind of the fight or flight things that are coming natural. And actually when we see people doing things and behaving in those ways, they've still got that, they're still trying to come from the best perspective. And we need to think actually how we can support our colleagues, our head teacher colleagues, our MAT leader colleagues, our colleagues in the social services and the local authority, to actually kind of calm that down and try and take more of a helicopter view to problems. So one of my big concerns is that actually the way this has happened is that every head teacher in the country and MAT leader has been forced to come up with their own solution. And what I see when I'm talking to a lot of school leaders is that people are already exhausted and that they're actually passing that down onto teachers too. And this is going to be a marathon and not a sprint. We're looking at the short term being maybe the next 2 or 3 weeks, medium term up to summer, but also the long term plan up till Christmas in terms of our thinking. And I think we need to be thinking about the workforce in those terms too. How can we support heads and teachers to be with us on that whole journey? Because the natural rest and respite points in the year aren't going to happen. And then if I may, just very quickly, I'll talk to you a little bit about what we're doing. So very early on, Tuesday last week, in fact, we deemed that none of our sites were safe for students because we're small. We've got 3 PRUs and 2 smaller mental health schools. And the ratio of student staff and the way those buildings are designed meant that we didn't feel that we could offer a safe service. So we turned into an outreach model where actually our main focus has been on getting food out to students. It's also been making daily calls to families and to students as well to see how they're doing and what other resources we can bring in. But the last thing I also want to touch on, which is something that Tom said, is that Chloe Middleton, who was the 21-year-old who passed away, was one of our ex-students. And so on Wednesday this week, I had to write the email to all of our staff to tell them that an ex-student who many of them will have known and taught had sadly passed away. And that this is something I think we all need to keep in mind, because as this situation worsens, there will be school leaders who are having to think about managing their workforce through this intense period and through grief, and making sure they have the support available and that they know who to turn to help them with this. So we had a CAMS LIMP worker, Jenny Murray, who I think might be on the call, who was invaluable to me at this point, because the only way I could possibly write that email to staff was to feel confident that I knew I was recommending the right approach to them and links to showing what support was available there. And all of this has happened within a week. So as a sector, I think everybody is doing amazing work. We're kind of getting on top of what our new normal is. So sorry, that was a lot of information there in my 2 minutes, but
thank you, yeah. And thanks for sharing some pretty tough stuff there.
Thank you.
I'm going to turn to Seb next, who comes at this having been a head teacher himself, but also with a real background of experience in community organising. And when we talk about this isn't something that schools and teachers can take on alone. I think that wider community part of the picture is crucial. So Seb, I know you've been doing lots of really useful thinking on key bits where we can jump in here. So I'll pass on to you.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone, and thank you, Tom and Loic, for the invitation to take part. So yes, I'm Sebastian Chaplot. I'm a former head teacher, so I led a school in South East London for 6.5 years, which I left at Christmas to become the director and the community organizer for the Big Education Conversation. And I guess our work over the past couple of weeks has been focusing on connecting to the hundreds of members we have across the UK and trying to amplify local issues, international, potentially campaigns and practical projects that we can work on to make sure that people don't feel isolated. Everybody's talking about the same things in their own individual schools and sometimes individual homes. And our job is about connecting all the dots and amplifying those voices and bringing about change through that. So 3 things that we've been working on quite doggedly, I would say, over the past couple of weeks. The first one, which I'm sure all of you will have heard about, is the food voucher scheme. So about 2 weeks ago, we got in touch with the British Retail Consortium to make sure that the big retailers like Tesco's and Asda's and Sainsbury's and so on work closely with the DfE to put in place a national scheme so that schools could purchase vouchers and then pass on to vulnerable families. There's been an announcement, obviously, but the scheme is not up and running yet. So we're still liaising with the DfE and retailers on, when will this happen and how effective will the scheme be. So we're still working on that, and hopefully there'll be a bit of clarity early next week. We're also asking questions around, the Easter break. Will the scheme be up and running throughout the Easter break and potentially the May half term? And would it also be available to schools to use for not just free school meal families, but families that perhaps don't have access to public funds? So so extending the reach of that scheme would be or is something that we're certainly looking into very, very seriously. And big credit to, or big gratitude to the Heads Roundtable for also working on this and doing a lot of good work on that. The second thing which we're working on, which thankfully Teach First sort of got involved in over the past couple of days, is access to data and electronic devices. Many of our schools have got amazing resources in place on their websites and other platforms, and that's really, really good. But we've also identified that a huge number of families don't have access to either data or devices to access the resources. So we're calling on data companies like EE, T-Mobile, Virgin to either uncap their data allowances for existing customers, or for the DfE to work with data companies to put on a scheme or to develop a scheme for, like the food voucher, for schools to access free vouchers that they can then pass on to their vulnerable families. I think there was an article today in Schools Week that said that only 2% of teachers across the Teach First network believe that all families have got access to data or devices, only 2%. So there's a huge need there for vulnerable families. And then the final one, which we're starting to explore, which is to do with FE colleges, is to make sure that those students who would have been on work placements, on practical work placements, don't get left behind. So we're trying to reach out to employers groups or large companies to see whether there are modules that we can put online or things that we could put in place for students to access online free of charge or subsidized by employers, not the small ones, but the big ones who perhaps have got more capacity to help with that, so that students who would normally have been on the ground, learning practical skills and then hopefully got jobs later on in the year, aren't left behind because of that. So I guess to summarize all this, what we're trying to do is connect all the little discussions or discussions going on across the country, and connect all the dots and amplify the issues and make them national, so that the DfE and whoever needs to responds more quickly to our needs. Thank you
so much, Seb. Really helpful, and really glad that you're hitting the ground running on some of those critical issues. Thank you. I'm next going to turn to Carly before going to Liz and Steve. I've just made a few switches to the order, if that's all right. So Carly, thank you.
Hi everybody, I'm Carly Waterman. I'm the head teacher at Lodge Park Academy in Corby in Northamptonshire Secondary School. Just to give you a sense of what my week's been like. So I've been in school all week with our skeleton staff and just the children of key workers or vulnerable children. There are very few of those. But we've also been doing lots and lots of work to support our families. So, for example, we've been providing laptops to our families, obviously making sure that they got their vouchers. So our voucher scheme is now up and running, but before it was up and running, we were handing out food packages. They were coming to school to collect them, or we were delivering them to homes. We're also supporting them all with remote support throughout this week, because as sort of Seb just mentioned, lots of our young people don't have access to Wi-Fi or laptops or computers. Some of them do have access to phones, and they're trying to access the online learning via phones, which isn't ideal. But we've also been doing lots and lots of doorstep visits, welfare calls, checking in with all our vulnerable children, but also kind of extending that reach beyond just children who are categorised as being vulnerable, but also the other children and other families that we know will be not necessarily coping with the strain of this. I think for me, my reflection this week has been that as a school, and perhaps also wider as an education sector, we've kind of defaulted into something that we know. And we know how to educate children. So we've kind of defaulted into an online version of what we know. And it's different because we're not all that technologically advanced, and perhaps, you know, remote learning is quite new to us. But I feel like that has been the main purpose, in a sense, of teachers. And part of me feels like that's slightly misguided, because I don't think we can actually teach and educate in the same way as we would do if children were in school. And I think we perhaps need to accept that and not agonize over curriculum and not agonize over whether or not children are making progress. And I think there's an element of that going on. I think for me it needs to be about welfare first and foremost, and I think it's about potentially redeploying our staff in a different way, or repurposing them, which is a word that Tom used earlier. Because if I think about my own staff, I've got the majority of my staff are teachers, and my pastoral team are relatively small. Now, my pastoral team are being amazing, and they're doing all of these welfare calls and doorstep visits and everything, being fantastic. But actually what I really need is probably a small army of people who can do more of the welfare stuff. So I'm thinking at the moment about how I use my teaching staff in perhaps a slightly different way. I mean, they're doing a fantastic job getting their heads around online learning, but that also puts pressure on them. I think they're working a huge amount of hours per day, and it's also putting huge amounts of pressure on my families and my children, who are thinking that they need to submit work to be marked, and that's adding pressure too. And really, I think the focus just needs to be on their emotional and physical health at the moment. So we're trying to do lots of other things about you know, asking them to make sure they go on their daily walk and to spend time with their families, to do things that they love. We're trying not to put too much pressure on. But for me, it's about how I am actually deploying my staff, taking the pressure off them, but also saying to them, don't forget that you're a tutor. And actually, when you're checking in with your children, it isn't necessarily just about have they done the work. It's about how are you, how are you coping? Because I think, being on the front line this week, I've talked to lots of families who are really, really struggling, who are facing eviction, who are really struggling with poverty, who are hungry, who are, so uncertain about the future. And that's obviously a really worrying thing. So for me, it's about just rethinking how we use our staff, and then also perhaps looking towards more local solutions. And certainly in the town that I'm in Corby, I'm in discussion with the other head teachers and the CEOs of the other trusts in this town to think about how, if we are in it for the long haul, how we might all work together to make that work.
Thanks, Carly. That's great. Yeah, particularly those ideas around the different parts of people's role, I think, and the relative weighting of pastoral and so on. And I guess tutors in terms of form tutors as well at secondary level, and their role with our tutor group. Okay, so we're going to turn to Liz next. So yeah, over to you, Liz. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Liz Todd. I'm Professor of Education and Inclusion at Newcastle University. Just to talk about what my research is. So my research looks for community solutions to education and social needs of children and families. And it does it in ways that tries to respect all families and children as having strengths and resources and assets, and involves them in decision making. So the kind of research I've done is very, very involved. It's really involved in the community, really kind of grassroots, using, for example, community organising approaches. And examples of it is we're working to develop a children's community in the West End of Newcastle with the West End Schools Trust, and we do lots of work in poverty proofing. As for kind of what the issues are, I really completely agree with what Carly's been saying. So, and I would go further than that, really. So for me, I don't think it can be business as usual. And I think we need to really kind of nail that really quickly, because the stress that's going to put on our own families and the families of teachers is massive anyway. So trying to kind of do a job as a teacher, as well as doing looking after your family and looking after all the things that you need to do in your own household is really, too much. So I think we do need to think of learning in a very different way, and what we want. So actually it's well-being and fun and being with your family and surviving your family is the kind of key thing. So for me, that's the kind of key thing. Then actually, the other thing is a lot of schools lack not necessarily even tablets, but the basic equipment of pens and paper. So actually thinking of some of those basic things, or activity packs, and food is obviously a massive thing, and it's really useful and helpful hearing about what people are doing in terms of different grab bag schemes, or I know West End women and girls in my own region have got a soup kind of delivery service going on this week. But actually, what is going to happen to families long term, and it's not just free school meal families, because actually people are not going to have any money till June. So there's a big sort of problem about all of that. Then in terms of the protecting, in terms of sort of child protection, I think that's the area that I'm most worried about, because I think probably the solutions I've seen that schools have been taking to do with learning, most schools are gravitating towards something very sensible and are saying, actually, we can't keep up just kind of churning out worksheets, and that's actually not what we need to be doing, or just lines and lines of online activities. But it's the whole thing of vulnerable children, I find it very difficult to see a solution to that, really. Given if we're not supposed to be kind of visiting, and I take it, and it's very helpful to hear that families are being visited, that people are knocking on their doors, but then you have to think about the welfare and the safety of those workers, and what kind of protection, because we haven't heard anything about protective masks and protective clothing for those kind of workers. So that's a kind of key concern of mine. I suppose in terms of what I've been doing and my week and what's been happening with me, I work in a university, so actually part of my week has been ringing around students in the university to make sure that the ones who stayed in Newcastle are well and okay, and what needs they've got. And the other thing I've been doing is putting stuff online, but again, we're just completely not doing business as usual. It's how do you make those learning outcomes in a very different way be met, not trying to do the same kind of thing. I'm also a professor, so the other thing I've been doing is that I'm a very much engaged professor. So it's listening. I've been trying to listen locally. What are people doing and what are their needs? And I'm a member of the West End Schools Trust. I'm a trustee of a group of schools. What do my schools need, and how can the university support that? We support things by getting people together, and like Seb was saying, in networking. So actually, what kind of networks and what kind of ways can we actually do this if we actually work together? And actually, again, the way that Carly was talking about. How can organisations work together to do that? The other thing I'm doing, because I'm also the director of the Institute of Social Science at the university, is what can our research expertise tell us about that? So, and I've been trying to mobilise people to actually push their research out in really easy to understand ways and get that research out there, but also what research we need to be doing now to understand what's happening to us, what we're doing to it now. So Rosie Bellini, one of our postgrad students in a place called Open Lab, she's doing tremendous work to do with perpetrators of abuse and vulnerable families and how we support them. Alison Stenning is doing some tremendous work to do with play and what messages are. How can you play at the moment? What play should you be doing? And then the final thing I'm thinking about is what happens after this. So what can we see about how we are mobilizing different ways of thinking, different ways of doing things? We're challenging some of those that we actually have to really focus on exams the whole time. That's gone out the window now for certain things. Does that make us think very differently about how we do education then? The way we've dealt with emergencies in communities, could we do this differently? The way that local authorities have become so important again, the way that schools have really, you're the key workers, delivery people are the key workers. How can that help us to think differently about how we do society when this finishes? And let's not just go back to normal, but actually take those messages and actually let's organize things differently in a different way going forward. So those are my thoughts.
Great, thank you, Liz. That's great. And it was definitely about striking a chord. There's definitely, I can see a request in the chat box from someone for some further reading and links there. So it's great to see that interaction. And also I see there's already some nice collaborations coming out of that chat box of people keen to work together. And I think that's really one of the most important things about today, is a chance for it to kick off those questions and ideas. So thank you. I'm next going to turn to Steve. And so Steve has the benefit of insight from quite a wide network of school leaders. So it'd be really useful to hear what you're getting from the helicopter view that Eleanor was talking about earlier on. So thanks, Steve.
Hi, hello. You can hear me okay?
Yeah.
Good, excellent. Yeah, thanks, Loic. So my name's Steve Rollett. I work for the Association of School and College Leaders, where I am the Curriculum and Inspection Specialist. So, I mean, the first thing, what you've just alluded to there, Loic, is absolutely right, which is that, we've got 19,500 members working in leadership positions in schools and colleges across the country. And so actually what we've been doing, and, thinking about different roles and the part we're all playing in helping to resolve this as best as we can and tackle the challenge. What we've been doing really is acting as a sort of a conduit, taking the questions, some of which are very, very specific, that those members have got about schools and what's going on in schools and colleges, and then taking that stuff right to the Department for Education, to government, and trying to get some feedback on that. And hopefully you'll have seen, particularly if you're an ASCL member, you'll have seen this regular newsletters from us on a daily basis, trying to answer those specific questions, and also trying to, as best as we can, and it's very, very tentative, but point towards what the way forward might look like. And I think one of the things that we've been keen to stress here, and it's been alluded to already by some of the speakers so far this morning, is that this isn't something that we're going to be able to tackle in sort of one bite. This is something that we're going to have to deal with in a sort of quite a phased approach, I think. And so what we saw from our members initially, and actually I think we're still very much in that phase, is that very, very short-term sort of almost a hand-to-mouth existence, trying just to work out how do we get through each day at a time. And I think it's so. The first thing is to say that's okay. None of us have chosen to be in this position. This is the card that life through the coronavirus has dealt us, and we're all of us doing the best that we can in very, very difficult situation. So that's where we are now. I think our hope is that as this progresses, we might settle into something more approaching a rhythm as we begin to answer more questions. And at that point, what we're hoping to do is to continue to do that important conduit work, but also trying to collate across the sector what seems to be working well for schools, for colleges, and for particular groups of young people. And then again, helping to make sure that messaging gets out there. And then, of course, ultimately, and we know this, but we're a long way away from it, I suspect, we're going to need to then start thinking about what does, people talk about with the virus at a national level, they talk about an exit strategy. And that's particularly relevant for schools, for colleges, and particularly for those most vulnerable young people out there. How do we go from whatever this looks like over the next period to then something that might approach normality again once more? And as I say, we're not there yet, but there will come a time where we need to start asking those questions. The reason I emphasise that about the phased approach is I think it's just helpful actually in helping us to manage what is actually a really stressful, difficult time for school leaders, for teachers there on the front line. And I will just say this as well. We know that lots of schools have moved to, for very good reasons, have moved to sort of, rota approaches. Carly, you talked about that in your school then, but it's the case as well, of course, that for a lot of school leaders, they find themselves on that rota every day. And so it's just worth keeping in mind that, this is something, that as I say, it's an association that represents school and college leaders. We're very concerned about making sure that those school leaders are best equipped to deal with that challenge. What I would like to do as well, just if I may quickly, is point you towards some joint guidance that's just been published that we've produced alongside colleagues in the NAHT and the NEU. And there is a section on there that talks specifically about working with vulnerable young people and safeguarding. Okay, so if you haven't yet seen that guidance, I'd strongly recommend that you have a look at that. And then the other thing I'd say as well, with my curriculum hat on, and interesting that both Liz and Carly have talked about this, which is this sense that it's not business as usual. And I think absolutely, I would echo that. It's not, this isn't going to look and feel the same as it did. Well, I would say this though, which is that I think it is really important that yes, we recognise it's not business as usual, but also we do remember that there is a really fundamental entitlement that young people have to learning. And actually, I worry particularly for vulnerable children that if we don't get that balance right, and I think there is a balance to be struck there, it's actually some of our vulnerable children who will rely on that contact, if you like, from the outside world, from their teachers, that work to not so much distract, but to help them look beyond the immediacy of the here and now. And I know that, as I say, the school leaders that up and down the country, that's the sort of thing that they're thinking very, very carefully about. And that's not something that we're going to resolve immediately. That's the sort of long-term thinking, I think, that, as I say, we may enter into over the next few weeks.
Great.
Okay, thanks, Loic.
Thanks, very helpful. Cheers. Kath, we're going to swing back to some of the things around alternative provision, I think, with you, but also more widely about vulnerable young people. So what have you been thinking about?
Thanks, Loic. So I'm Kath Murray. I lead on alternative provision research and policy at the Centre for Social Justice. And yeah, thanks for Eleanor, the first contribution. She's one of the schools that's contributed to our survey. We've put out a survey this week of all alternative provision schools, and even in this busy time, we've been really grateful that 13% of all AP schools in the country have responded to the survey. We've been asking them what their most urgent needs are right now, so that we can message that to the government. And the Department for Education is really receptive and really wants to hear that, which is really good to know. I think we're all kind of working collaboratively right now, which is wonderful. So there was a lot of talk about the online learning piece, which obviously is really important, and it's so good to hear all the people who are working on that and getting internet access to children. I think that surveying AP schools, what we found was that it's not the primary worry for them right now, because actually there's more basic concerns about keeping children safe. So one head teacher told us that in the first 2 days of this week, they had to make 2 referrals to social care because following calls from the police about domestic violence incidents at their students' homes. We've got a real worry that over the coming months, children who are already disengaged from education will become even more so. The NEET figures for children educated in AP are already at 50%. There's a concern about increased involvement in gangs, county lines. Some head teachers have mentioned worries about teen pregnancies, for example. So I think the question that we've heard AP schools grappling with is, how do they now look after vulnerable young people when those people are not coming in? So the attendance levels, even though they qualify AP schools to have children in as vulnerable students, just like mainstream schools, they're having very, very low rates of attendance right now. And so, as Eleanor was talking about, a lot of the service becomes about outreach and how do you do that? And there's not really a model for that. So they're all trying to work it out. A lot of AP schools feel they're filling gaps left by absent social workers. 1 in 7 have been specifically asked to do welfare checks by the local authority, and that sounds like it's happening either on a daily, some are doing it twice a day, some are doing it daily, and some are doing it every 48 hours with their vulnerable students, making phone calls home. Not all students or parents are picking up the phone, however, so we're hearing concerns from AP schools that are already about losing touch. And then, as other people have spoken about, safety comes in different guises. We've also got the concerns for staff and student health and welfare. 1 in 5 AP schools were concerned about a lack of running hot water or hand sanitizer as their primary concern. And also, at the very, very top of the list for everybody was a need for clarity of information from local and national government. For example, I don't know if anybody saw the story last week on social media of foster families being asked on Thursday by local authorities. A number of local authorities put out letters to foster carers saying, please send your children into school as usual because they're vulnerable children. And then on Friday, the government guidance came out saying, actually, please hold all children at home if you possibly can. And so there's a lot of confusion about the guidance there. We heard from one AP head who has a foster family who's sending 3 different foster children to 3 different schools every day. And so the risk of contamination in that sense is obviously increased for everybody. And then, while education wasn't top of the list for AP schools, it was mentioned by 1 in 4 of them. One head teacher estimated that 50% of the homes of their families don't have internet access. So it's really good to hear that people are working on that. I think what we're really concerned about is that while some children will spend this period getting ahead with their learning, or at least staying on top of their learning, if they've got the kind of family environment that allows that to happen, the attainment gap is going to obviously widen because the vulnerable children that we're thinking about might not be doing any of that. So that's something that policymakers really need to get ahead of, and it's really good to hear those conversations happening. I think what we're focused on right now, though, and AP schools are focused on right now, is that a lot of them feel they can't even think about curriculum and learning. It's just basic needs. And what they're asking for is that the local council speak to them and develop a joint strategy with AP schools. And from what Carly was speaking about today, and potentially even mainstream schools, I would say, and people working on the front line, phoning children every day, delivering food to homes, identifying needs, And so a joint local strategy that involves schools and the local authority, I think is really important here. So yeah, that's all we've heard. And thank you.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you. And it's interesting that several of the themes you picked up there, Kath, are actually themes that came out more widely. So when you all signed up, obviously you submitted some information and thoughts. So we had the benefit of info from 200 people there. And that question about kind of how many times you contact different young people, the sort of triage element, and we had quite a lot of schools who were introducing approaches to kind of rag rating all their students to work out what level of support to put in, because that's kind of part of the triage exercise. There's also lots of concerns about the widening of the attainment gap. I know that Laura Fraser from Teach First has also raised that in the webinar chat. So the impact there is a really important one too. And finally, you mentioned local councils and local authorities and the sort of reconfiguration of their role and where they might fit in the picture and what that means for their role. So lots of important themes there. Great. I'm now going to turn to Ben. So over to you, Ben. You'll need to unmute yourself.
Yes, thanks, Luke. Hi, so my name is Ben Gadsby. I am Policy and Research Manager at Impetus. We're a charity that focuses on making sure disadvantaged young people succeed in school, in work and in life. We don't do any direct delivery ourselves. We fund direct delivery charities and we work shoulder to shoulder with them to make sure they have the biggest possible impact on the young people that so many of us are on this call because we care about. I'm kind of lucky. I'm always in awe of practitioners because I'm not one myself. I'm a policy person. And frankly, what practitioners are dealing with at this time, I am in no way jealous of you, and I'm even more in awe than I was before this started. I guess as an outsider, there are kind of three sort of big picture questions that I have that I think are worth working through. The first question, and I think this comes back to what Liz said about what happens after this. We don't actually know when after this is. So my first big question is whether we need to be thinking about how we repair the damage that's currently ongoing, or whether we need to think about changing the way we work to prevent the damage happening, which particularly if this is going to be a sort of 12-month, 18-month thing, and projections suggest, there's going to be a lot of need to think about doing things differently. Whereas if we get lucky and this is all over in 3 months, maybe by the time we've worked out how to do things well, we've all moved on, and actually maybe the effort is better spent thinking about how to kind of close the attainment gaps that we know are widening, how to kind of repair some of that damage. So that's my first big question, is that repair versus change question. The second point I just want to make very quickly is I think everybody feels like this is a giant game of whack-a-mole at the moment, where moles keep just appearing everywhere and you have to kind of deal with one thing, and as soon as you've dealt with one thing, another thing is going to appear. And that I think is particularly true of government. And as anyone who's ever played whack-a-mole at an arcade will know, you never get to whack all the moles. And I think this actually presents a little bit of an opportunity because, there were lots of things that the government just does not have time to think about right now. There are lots of things that local authorities don't have time to think about. And some of them are things that we're thinking about through conversations like this. And I think there's a real opportunity if we can work out how to whack those moles. When the government gets around to it, they will be looking for quick and easy solutions. So actually, I know practitioners have often complained that, kind of government doesn't listen to them, or people only listen to kind of select voices. I think there's a real opportunity here for practitioners to be listened to if we can kind of collectively and collaboratively come up with solutions to some of these problems. And the final thing I just want to say very quickly to kind of keep the positivity up is big change is possible on some of this kind of stuff. I've seen some interesting comments already in the chat about things like, the role of schools as civic institutions, whether we've under-prioritized life skills and stuff. I think there's a real opportunity to make big change happen on some of these questions. I mean, big change is happening every single day. You only have to turn on the news to see that. So I know it's very easy to be overwhelmed by the kind of the immediate challenges and the day-to-day and all those kind of immediate moles that are popping up in front of you that need whacking. But there is an opportunity here, I think, to make really positive long-term change. And I hope that's something that we'll all be able to work together on. And I'm looking forward to picking up lots more ideas through this call and the chat.
Thank you. That's very helpful. So I mentioned the kind of reconfiguration of, well, the role of a local authority in this. Obviously, school trusts play a really big part in this, which is why I'm going to turn to Leora next from Confederation of School Trusts.
Thank you so much. Hello, everybody. I'm Leora. I'm the Chief Executive of the Confederation of School Trusts. Like Steve from ASCL, our job has been business as unusual in the last 2 weeks. We've seen our job as supporting schools and trusts and making sure that we're feeding all the kinds of issues that colleagues have been talking about into the national effort to the COVID-19 gold response within the department. And making sure that all of those issues that you're talking about are reflected in what the DfE is thinking about. For now, I would like to talk about the path from crisis to resilience and recovery. And I think we need to talk about resilience and recovery in at least 4 different ways. First of all, building resilience and helping families to recover. So Tom made the really important point in his opening remarks about the bereavement, the kind of bereavement that we are going to see in families. There are also going to be significant mental health challenges, and a number of colleagues, including Kath, have mentioned the impact of domestic violence, and there will be a spike in domestic violence. So looking at how we build resilience of children and young people and families as part of our recovery seems really important to me. The second bit is around schools. So how do we create resilience and prepare schools for a recovery, prepare schools to reopen? A number of people have made the point about the resilience of the workforce. We will need to make sure that we've got in place the teachers to reopen schools when schools are reopened, but possibly in September. We also need to think about resilient governance in relation to schools in this period. CST has been talking a lot about school trusts as new civic structures, and I think in a really interesting way, the idea that schools and trusts are civic institutions and are part of that resilience and recovery has really come to the fore, certainly in the last week. That's the sort of second area of resilience and recovery. The third area, I think, is around the community. So just as we're building resilience of children, young people and families, we also need to be looking at the community resource and how we help communities to recover from the impact that this will undoubtedly have on communities. And finally, system resilience. So I don't think we've paid enough attention at the moment to how we build more resilience into government. So while we've been talking, perhaps others will have seen that there's been an announcement that the Prime Minister has COVID-19. So that's fairly shocking. So the whole kind of infrastructure of government, the infrastructure of local government, how do we make sure that, that those structures are also resilient? I'd like to end with talking about the best of the human spirit, really. And I think we have seen the best of the human spirit emerge in the past 2 weeks. And to Ambition and CFEY, I applaud the fact that you are running this webinar and that you are recording it. I think we need more ways of social documenting what we are experiencing, because I recognise that this is an overused word, Tom, but this is unprecedented in our lifetime, and I think we need to record the social response, the resilience of the human spirit, and something that gave me great fortitude was to leave my house yesterday to go for a run in the park, and I live next door to 2 little twin boys, and they had written on the pavement in chalk. They'd done a beautiful drawing, beautiful chalk drawing, and in the centre of that was "Nothing will stop spring." And I think that's a good thing to remember.
Lovely, thank you. Yeah, it's really important that something like this have this element of the uplifting and the hopeful too. So thank you. Great. So we had a lot of the macro perspective there too, and I'm going to turn to Joe, who can really, I think, speak to some of the questions we've had around safeguarding and well-being here, and some of the individuals in all of this. So over to you, Joe. And
hi everyone.
Sorry, Joe will be our last speaker for now, and then we'll be summarising some of the thoughts from a discussion, so that you can all feed your thoughts in there. So if you want to whack anything in quick before Will does his summary, then make sure you flag that in the chat box. And also a reminder that there are also people who are following this through Twitter. So those of you who are watching, please do tweet with the hashtag COVID Roundtable. Over to you, Joe.
Thanks, Loic. Hi everyone. I'm Joe Taylor. I'm an educational psychologist. I work in London. I also support some organisations that work in education and social change. And I'm hoping to really provide a psychological perspective in this conversation. I think that's a theme that's really come up listening to everybody talk. Well-being, welfare, mental health, all of these things have been talked about, and they're all really big topics. And from my point of view, I think that they all really call for community level approaches, not just individual level approaches. In terms of what I am hoping to do today, I'm going to share a link to a Twitter thread that I have with lots of resources that I thought would be useful, or that I thought I'd talk about, because I've seen in the comments that people are kind of really wanting to get their hands on the resources that people are mentioning. So that's a commitment from me, just to kind of frame that before I start talking. I also just want to flag the hope that I'm feeling right now. It is a really difficult and uncertain time, and that can lead us into a place where we're feeling really intense emotions and difficult emotions, but we're having a conversation today with lots of different people, perspectives and knowledge, and I think that is something that gives me hope. My week has been very conversation based. I've been talking to the schools that I work with. They all seem to have a slightly different experience and approach, and that means that I'm having to be really responsive and give them lots and lots of time to think and keep on checking back in with them. I think that probably reflects how people are doing on a national level. People are trying to work out the best way to move forward. In terms of the psychological community, there have been really short, succinct pieces of guidance that have been put out about how to deal with having a smaller staff group at school, how to deal with how children are home, how to talk to children about COVID-19 and big uncertain topics, what to do. So I suppose there are those national level things going on. There are also individual things going on in my own practice. So just trying to design remote offers for supporting staff mental health, for thinking about preempting mental health difficulties with children, things like that. So there's been lots of thinking, lots of talking. One thing to flag is that education psychology services quite often help with critical incidents. So a critical incident might be a moment where somebody dies, or something really big and confusing and scary happens. And in the local authorities that I've worked in, there's been a pot of money that either schools have paid into or that is funded by the local authority for these occasions. And so I know that in our team, we've been talking a lot about what that might look like as there are bereavements and as things kind of move on. So that's something to flag, because I don't know that people know much about that service. So it's just to put it out there that it might be your local educational psychology service can help with those kind of conversations and planning those processes. I suppose I would finish up on what I view as an opportunity. And that opportunity really is to think about the ecosystem that children are living within, the different people around them, the different processes around them, and to be designing interventions which try and provide something on multiple levels around them. So you know, that might be on the physical, it might be on the psychological, it might be supporting their parents or carers or the professionals around them. I think that these kind of conversations especially are a really powerful chance to do that, because we have different experiences and we work at different levels around children and families. So that seems like a nice place to kind of leave it. I'm really excited to see and hear what we can come up with together today.
Okay, thank you. That's great, Joe. So we've now got half an hour to discuss some of what's come out so far. So I'm going to turn to Will to give us a little summary of what you've all been sharing in the chat box. So over to you, Will.
Thanks, Loic. And thanks to all our contributors, both our panelists for their, really thought-provoking contributions, and also for the engagement we've had via the chat box and via Twitter. Some really interesting themes coming through. So firstly, just to start on a positive, loads of ideas being shared already, lots of requests for collaboration, lots of research being shared, lots of ideas, resources being shared. So that's really exciting. We've had requests for summaries of the roundtable and the main points raised, but Loic, I'll bounce that back to you. I know that you'll outline next steps at the end of this session, so I'll leave that one for you to deal with.
Yeah.
So in terms of some of the main themes then that have come through contributions from our wider attendees, first key theme is around collaboration, and there are several dimensions to this. So firstly, it's really, really important for sectors, for organisations that are not on the front line, to be listening very closely to the professionals who are on the front line and making sure that we're being really responsive on that front. Secondly, joining professionals who are working within and across different settings, contexts and sectors. Particular emphasis coming through from attendees on the importance of linking in with youth workers on that front, to engage schools right now. Youth sector having lots to offer, particularly in terms of the relationship building side of things. There's an emphasis on the fact that this collaboration is important both right now, there's a need for that immediately, but also in the long term, and how we deal with this situation once relative normality is restored. Finally, I think it's important to acknowledge a frustration that's come through in some of the comments around sometimes contradictory policy coming from sort of higher up the system, so to speak, but also disconnect between different levels of the system. So a feeling of, sometimes a feeling of isolation by practitioners working on the front line from the policy decisions coming down from over up the system. Second key theme is around the need for long-term thinking. Third key theme is around professionals' well-being and compassionate leadership. So the emphasis on self-care being vital for practitioners, but I think actually also the acknowledgement that it needs to go beyond self-care. This isn't just about the professionals working with young people. The onus is not on them to look after themselves solely. This is also dependent on a system response. Really nice point here that actually lots of the informal networks that we already have in place, for example on EduTwitter, can play a really important role here, providing real-time support for professionals when they need it. But as I say, an acknowledgement that the system has to be responsive on that front too. Another key theme, clearly a vital one, is around pupils' well-being. So already people really liking the idea of Carly's well-being calls, but the self-evident fact, I think, that well-being is harder for some young people to maintain than for others. I think a particularly important point, and one that I'm going to come back to when I pose my questions in a second, is around young people who are not on local authorities' radars already. So we might be talking here about children on the edge of care, but who are not actually formally part of that system. There's recognition that they're particularly vulnerable to falling through the gaps here. Finally, a key theme around, and sorry, this in relation to pupils' well-being, the well-being of pupils who are transitioning between phases and between schools. So that might be between primary and secondary, that might be from secondary off into post-16 provision, but I think also important here are the young children who are starting primary school and what their transition from early years into year one might look like. Another theme being around families with limited resources. So I think just reinstating the points that some of our panelists have made, this is really tough for some of the more vulnerable families in the system who will right now be lacking money, they'll be lacking food. They'll also be lacking access to some of the services that perhaps some of the more affluent or advantaged families have access to along the lines of Wi-Fi. So there's been positive response from some data companies, for example, uncapping data limits. And there was a suggestion, someone pointed out that MAT, a multi-academy trust, has been purchasing dongles for poorer families, which I think is a really nice idea. Acknowledgement for those same families that parents are having to dramatically change their role. They're going from being parents to being teachers, teaching assistants. They're learning how to support learning, impart learning, but also how to deal with technology. Sometimes in relatively cramped environments. Finally, and this is the final key theme that I'm going to throw into the mix before, as I say, I pose my questions. Professional role has been shifting. So teachers' professional roles in particular has been shifting, as our panelists have been acknowledging. But I think also the role of professionals in other parts of the system as well. For teachers, this has involved a movement away from imparting knowledge and imparting the curriculum to something that's more holistic. And also this idea that schools currently are being repositioned as civic institutions. Okay, so those are some of the key themes that have been coming through from our attendees. So I'm going to pose some questions now. I have 6 questions.
And just to say, if panelists, if you could use the raise your hand function if you particularly want to respond to a point, come to you, and you can always message me to say what it is that you're particularly keen to respond to.
Okay, all right. So first question is, how should we be conducting safeguarding under this new normal? Second question is, what is our new professional role and what are our professional priorities now? Third question, I'm going to split into two parts. So the first is, how do we support young people who are not currently on local authorities' radars, but who are vulnerable? And the second part of that question, how should we be supporting pupils transitioning between phases and between schools? So 2 questions there about pupil well-being. There's a question here about whether we should be rethinking the content of the curriculum. So quite a lot of discussion among attendees about whether we should be reorientating towards, for example, skills and transferable competencies over and above pure content in the form of academic knowledge. So I'm going to throw that one into the mix. With the associated question about how do we also simultaneously maintain high academic aspirations for all of the young people in the system. 5th question, how do we continue to protect staff and pupils physically during this process? Is there a need to be thinking about protective clothing and equipment in order to be providing services on an ongoing basis? 6th question, can we keep sharing examples of collaboration, particularly between schools and the youth sector, but also between the school settings, youth sector and universities?
Okay, thank you. And your question 6 there, which was about the youth sector, actually is a perfect segue. I've invited one of our attendees, who's Abby from the National Youth Agency, to just jump in very briefly to say something about the role of the youth sector in there, which is something she raised. So Abby, just over to you briefly, if that's okay.
Hi everybody. Yeah, thank you very much for your points so far. This has been really useful and really interesting for me. Just to kind of update you a little bit on where the youth sector is in relation to this and what we're doing. So collaboratively, as part of the Back Youth movement, the National Youth Agency and UK Youth have come together to develop a web resource for youth workers and for young people during this time. So I can share that link with you. There's lots and lots of really useful information and materials on there that you might be able to use. For example, how do we operate safeguarding in a digital world, which I know some of you talked about, doing calls and connections and different ways of keeping in touch with young people. We're also using that web resource from next week as a way to start sharing and collaborating stories of good work that's happening. For example, I know in lots of different areas, schools are already engaging with youth workers and the youth service, particularly around the 2 points that you just made, Will, about how do we create better collaboration? So how are we connecting in what's happening for those vulnerable young people, both educationally and outside and with universities, and also how to create support for those young people that might potentially fall through the gaps. So I think for me, one of the key things that is important for us to identify a way through is how we bridge the gap between the really important work that's still happening in schools and also how youth work can support that and adds value to that for young people who might not be attending school because their parents aren't key workers or because they're hugely vulnerable. And I'm really open to hearing people's thoughts and ideas on what might be working in your areas if there's already examples of really good collaboration.
Great. Thanks so much, Abby. That's really helpful and good of you to jump in without any pretty much no forewarning. So much appreciated. Great. I'm going to turn to Ellen now, who wanted to respond to some of those questions that Will raised.
Thanks, Loic, and thank you everyone, because it's been fascinating listening to your contributions. So just to respond to a couple of the questions, the first one on how should we be conducting safeguarding. For me, this is where we really need to be looking at multi-agency approaches that go beyond what we currently think of as school structures and the existing way that things work together. So in Buckinghamshire, I've been lucky that every night our Director of Children's Services pulls together a working group with representatives from schools, from social care, from special needs department, and we're having those conversations at that level about actually what the resources are and how we can work together. Because by moving to the sort of model that we have, which is outreach, our staff are falling over themselves to volunteer to get involved, but we as leaders need to know that we are taking that responsibility when we're asking them to go and visit people in their homes. And we need to make sure that for everyone in the sector, we're not duplicating that risk. So we're looking at actually who is best placed to deliver what needs doing for those specific families, and that we're doing that as together holistically rather than sending lots of different people in at the same time to work with the same families. And that should also give us more resource to spread across rather than just looking at those most in need. If we're thinking actually about, I mean, we're viewing all of our students in AP at the moment that they're all vulnerable on the level that qualifies. And so that's the approach that we have to take, because even those that maybe before were just on the margins, we don't know what is going to be happening to them behind their doors over the coming months. We don't know the impact on lost relatives, on sick parents, on job losses. What we hear from our students and their families is they are scared. And we have parents who are scared because their young people won't stay at home because they're not used to it. And then every time they come back, they're scared of the young person bringing something into the home. So the way we relate to families and what we expect of them also needs to be something that we do multi-agency and across the sector too. So we're making sure the same message gets out. And the other one is just something that I've been banging on with. If anybody saw my Schools Week article around, you know, what's our role now, is that I think we need to stop calling this school. I really think that actually we're still talking about schools and school structures. My estimate is that will get us to maybe Thursday or Friday next week, and then that's it. The sooner that we start looking at this being a solution to a problem that is bigger than schools and is outside of that system and that structure and is something new, the more flexible we can all be when we're looking at designing real, concrete, effective answers to the problems that we're facing. So that's the 3 questions I wanted to come back on straight.
Right. Thank you. Cheers. Laura.
Thank you, Loic. So I wanted to also answer the question on safeguarding and then come to the question on academic knowledge. In relation to safeguarding, I have said to the Secretary of State that I believe that we now need an addendum to keeping children safe in education, which is obviously the statutory guidance that we all follow. So there's specific challenges that we're all facing in the COVID-19 response. And I think to have a broad protocol that we're all following, rather than every school, every trust, every local authority sort of making it up, would actually now be not only helpful but essential. So just to say that I have asked for that. On the issue of academic knowledge, I think I'm going to slightly disagree with Eleanor and perhaps 1 or 2 others. I think it is alongside welfare considerations, which are obviously paramount at the moment, it is absolutely important that we protect the integrity of schools as knowledge institutions, as academic institutions where children learn. It is our children and young people who are going to solve some of the problems that we face. And it is I believe it is our sacred duty actually to protect their right to learn and to learn a good academic curriculum.
Okay. And I think that's actually one of the questions that's really controversial, and that's a bit of the crux question. So I think quite a few of our panelists are happy to respond to that one if they have some different views. I'm going to turn to Carly to just say a little bit about the 3rd and 4th question. So those young people who are on the kind of margins of vulnerability and labels and transitions, and then a little bit perhaps on that controversial curriculum question.
Actually, I'll start with that if that's okay.
Yeah, no worries. And
then just go back to the vulnerable children one. So I think I absolutely agree with Leora about the sort of the sacred nature of schools as sort of these academic institutions. I do think that's really important, but I also think that for me personally, that's more important in that recovery phase that Leora talked about earlier. And that journey towards recovery and resilience. I feel right now that actually if we continue to try and sort of hold on to that integrity of us as being an academic institution and as a purveyor of knowledge, we're going to fail at that in the short term, because our teachers can't do the things that they've been trained to do, to be the experts in their disciplines. They can't do that as well remotely, and I almost don't want them to either as well, because I want to also preserve the fact that the face-to-face teaching is the thing that we do so well and want to get back to in the future. So I kind of agree and also disagree. I just feel like in the moment right now that perhaps that's the nature of retaining the curriculum just isn't a priority at this point, but it doesn't mean that I don't think it's massively important in the future, in particular to make sure that we don't continue to allow those gaps to widen. But I also I guess I just feel like we ought to have a bit of hiatus on that right now, whilst we deal with these sort of more immediate concerns. And then to the response to the question 3 about supporting children who are a little bit off our radar, I just think we shouldn't underestimate how well we know our children. I mean, even in a school like mine, it's not massive, but it's 900 children. We know our children so well. And I think what we need to do is focus on a kind of team around the child. And I think about who knows that individual child best in our school. Well, their form tutor, 1 or 2 of their teachers, perhaps their pastoral leader, or people that they interact with, perhaps their SENCO, their LSA. And I think what we need to do is say, well, actually, ongoing throughout this period, who is the small team around that child? How well do they know them and their families, and be the ones who are having that constant contact with them to support them with whatever barriers they may be facing? And that might be academic, so it might be about accessing remote learning, but equally it might be about managing their emotions, dealing with bereavement, stress, anxiety, any of those things. And I just kind of like to repurpose and redeploy staff in that way, really, so that we kind of recognise how well they know their children. I think families would appreciate that as well, and certainly the feedback we've had so far from our families in our school is that this week they have appreciated so much that we have been on the end of the phone, or we've been doing doorstep visits. We've been basically trying to solve any problems they have whatsoever, and it doesn't matter what kind of problem it was, we were just there to solve their problems and to reassure them. So I think that's kind of the immediate concern, certainly for me and my community anyway.
Just a minor interruption from Eleanor. You said something burning, apparently.
Yeah, sorry, just Leora, in case
Make
I
a quick
misunderstood, I wasn't suggesting we got rid of school structures and that's it, burnt it to the ground and put something else in place. What I'm thinking is actually we have a short-term response, which is based very much on meeting the need we have right now. Then we have the medium term, maybe up to summer, and then we have the longer term to Christmas, because things are going to continue to be like that. And my thing about response is this immediate bit. Thank
Brilliant.
you.
Okay, I'm moving fast just because we are going to come to the end soon, so I want as many voices as possible. So Steve, very briefly, and then Ben, very briefly.
Okay, thanks for that. So I want to pick up that curriculum question and just give my input on that one briefly. So it's what I was talking about before and what Carly's just talked about. I think what Laura was talking about as well is this idea of a phased approach and knowing where we are in this process, but making sure that those are deliberate decisions that we're making, I think, that leaders are making, and being able to say in the here and now, actually, this is what is the main thing right now, and that's partly about what's in the best interest of children, but it's also about managing your staff through what is a difficult period. But then recognising we will have to then start thinking, as I say, about that rhythm, what that looks like in terms of the curriculum, and then the longer term thing regarding sort of re-entry, in a sense, reintegration back into school. What I'd like to say though is the question specifically mentioned about the, should it be knowledge, should it be skills? I don't want to reopen old wounds, but I am just going to say this, of course, we just need to remember that that's not a dichotomy that probably is ever particularly helpful for us. So if children are learning knowledge or developing skills through the curriculum, that is whatever they're doing now that is helping them to learn more about the world and be able to do more, know more, that's useful, and we need to hold on to that. So I want to offer 3 words that I think will be helpful, I hope, to people. One of them is about richness, and I think that's what Carly was talking about, which is having a broad view of what we want for children to be learning about at the moment. All sorts of good stuff going on out there, as well as the stuff that teachers are asking students to do from home. So richness is important. The other thing I think is repetition as well, and we know that actually for some of those students, I'm thinking here particularly about year 10s, for example, year 12s, who we will want to, particularly with that academic focus, we will want to keep for some of them as we enter that rhythm phase. Keep them boiling and keep that stuff fresh in their mind. So we know that spaced repetition, for example, works quite well in that regard. And the third R word is possibly the most important, which is about us being realistic in terms of what we can achieve again. And that comes back to that phasing. So richness, repetition, and being realistic. I hope that's helpful. Thanks, Alex.
Great. Okay. And I'm going to have just a minute from our last speakers, who are going to be Ben, Joe, Deb, and Liz. So 1 minute each, if that's okay. I know that's really tight, but I do want to keep it brief and give Tom and I just a chance to round us off after that.
I don't have 3 R's, but I do have a quick contribution on the curriculum piece. So we've been doing a piece of research with the government's LEO data, longitudinal educational outcomes, looking at people's long-term outcomes based on education. And one of the things that we found with that is, so first of all, disadvantaged young people are about twice as likely to be NEET as their better off peers once they've left school, but only half of that is due to qualification. So if you could equalise qualification between disadvantaged young people and their better off peers, you would still find disadvantaged young people are about 50% more likely to be NEET. That's our Youth Jobs Gap research. What is that 50%? I think that's where the kind of the transitions piece and the skills piece comes in. So as Steve said, definitely not a dichotomy, need both.
Great. Okay, thank you. Joe, 1 minute.
Okay, so I really like the framing of a phased approach. At the moment, things are uncertain and we aren't quite sure how teachers are going to be working, support staff are going to be working, and it is really important that we think about how to look after ourselves. But I don't think that there should be an emphasis on individuals to be solely responsible for those caring and self-care routines. I think we need a way for making those routines spread out a bit more across our community. In terms of thinking about mental health and preempting difficulties, there is a really great research base from contemporary resilience research. All of the resources that I'm talking about are in a thread. I don't have time to go into it, but I do think that there are also really important considerations around endings. Think about transitions and all those kind of things, and relationships. If we're having children moving from one setting to another, or not seeing people, being able to say goodbye to people they previously learned with, we need to be thinking about how to facilitate all of those things to prevent difficulties with mental health and preserve well-being.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, thank you. Okay, Seb, Liz, and then Kath.
Yeah, Thanks, Luke. I'll be very brief. And you know, building on the point on relationships, what I would say is that the success of our current society and also democracy depends on the strength of the relationships that we establish between the different parts of our society. And I think what we're seeing currently is this happening in practice. We are seeing schools working more closely with, you know, taxi drivers in Nottingham to deliver meals to vulnerable families. We're seeing, you know, thousands of people stepping up to volunteer to help the NHS. We're seeing schools, you know, really become community hubs. So I think, you know, this is what we're currently, you know, going through. And I think moving forward, it's key that we establish ways to, you know, to strengthen civil society so that the state and the market can meet our needs much better than they are. Ultimately, you know, we set up the state, we set up the market to serve our needs. And it's time that that sort of, you know, we flip back the narrative to make sure that that happens, because it's not otherwise.
Great. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's such an impressive response to some of the you know, everyone stepping up at this moment. Liz.
So I want to make two main points. One is thinking about the skills versus academic. So I've got two examples. One is amazing Chillingham Road Primary School in Heaton, hearing about the amazing things that they're doing to support their students, sending home a novel, some exercise books, and then 5 activities a day. And that is something that the teachers are managing to do and the parents are finding useful. Another example is a GCSE child, a friend of mine, who is so relieved, so incredibly relieved when he didn't have to attend school this week, because he'd been self-harming and was really worried. And the whole thing of, are you going to get a 9 rather than a 7, and this whole exam emphasis and the massive pressure on you teachers, which you really support, you managed to rise to. I don't know how. Couldn't have done it when I was a teacher. But so my thing is, yes, I think that knowledge is important. The integrity of schools is massively important. I totally agree. But we don't have schools at the moment where we can really focus on that. We have schools where, as my own children's head teacher said, this is an exam factory, and he was proud of it, and I was horrified. I know that's not how most people view them, and I'm sure that's not how you view them here. But what I'm saying is, in terms of the short term, we've got to really take on board it's not business as usual. In terms of getting through this whole coronavirus time, we have to totally reevaluate how we're going to do it and think about it very differently. In terms of the longer term, then I think there's an opportunity to saying knowledge is very important, but actually we don't want to go back to this massive stress just on exams. So what would we do? And then my final other point was to do with, it's great to have Jo Taylor here. That's my previous, I'm still an educational psychologist by professional background, and so it's great to have an ed psych here. However, austerity has pared back family workers, education welfare workers. Ed psychs now focus, the ed psychs I know anyway, focus so much on just doing assessments and not doing the amazing community and family and support and well-being and mental health work that you can do. So this is, again, an opportunity to think, actually, we've pared back all those people from austerity, but we really need, again, to repurpose all these professionals in a very different way.
Okay, thank you. And Kath, 30 seconds.
Okay, thanks. Just wanted to make a point about a little bit responding to what Leora was saying earlier. I totally agree that teachers are not social workers and teachers are there to teach. I think that at the moment, though, what we need to look at is this kind of idea of the hierarchy of needs, which is that, yes, there are lots of children that can access education and might need a quick fix, might be internet access, it might be a laptop, etc. But there are, and that's the area that I'm concerned is the children who are in our AP schools, for example, and there'll be some in our mainstream schools too, that are just falling off the radar and they're not ready to learn. And then it becomes about those basic needs. So I don't think we need to say teachers are social workers. At the same time, social workers are off work. We already had really tight a kind of a lack of social worker, and we know that councils are underfunded. So now that we've got social workers off work, who is doing that work? And we don't want teachers long term to be social workers, but then we need a conversation about who's filling that gap now. And right now, what the AP teachers are saying to me is, we know those children, we have a relationship. It makes sense for us to step in and do that role, that kind of welfare role right now. But I totally see what Leora is saying about let's keep the focus on education. But as Eleanor was saying, there is kind of a crisis response needed.
Great. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. That's fantastic. Tom, do you want to have a go at saying a few rounding off things, and then I shall try and do a 1-minute summary of absolutely everything.
Thanks. So I'll try and keep this quick because I'm sure everyone's got other things they need to get onto, and children at the door and all these kind of things.
All on the call.
Yeah. Hi. So I'd just like to thank everyone for the contributions that they've made, either through the video or on the chat as well. I've sat here and kind of digested a huge amount from that. I think 3 points really quickly. The first is about resilience, and I think the kind of announcement of our Prime Minister having the virus and the kind of questions about resilience that brings should ask us it's a prompt, isn't it, to think about what knowledge lives in individuals' heads, and how much do we rely on individuals within schools who kind of either hold relationships with people particularly well, or kind of process knowledge really well. How can we sort of share that in a way to build resilience? I think that's been a big theme for me. I think the second one is around this kind of purpose of school and curriculum, and I think that my reflection here is that I don't think these two things are in tension. I think that we can believe that the power of education to transform lives through a really rigorous curriculum, through qualifications, is real and true. And we can also believe that schools have a place to play at this moment in time, which is different to that purpose. And I think that the discussion around phasing is a really important one. And I think there's lots to think about how much we invest. So Ben's point about how much we invest time in things in the short term, that by the time we get good at them, we might not be doing them anymore, and how much we invest time thinking about the exit strategy of this period that we're in, and actually how we reopen schools and how we assess who knows what again, and how we restart curriculum and those types of things. I think they're like really big challenges for us to sort of get into, and I know we haven't really got there yet, and that's understandable. And I think the third thing, and is optimism really, which came through Leora's speech and contribution, that like this will pass, and as difficult as it's going to be, we will move through this period, and we will emerge from it with some new knowledge and some new ways of working and some partnerships as a profession, and that's something that I'll keep with me, I'm sure, Leora. So thank you for that intervention, particularly. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, well, I certainly echo. I feel really quite lucky to have spent this hour and a half with 190 amazing people. It's really brilliant, and I think it's captured. I think Leora's phrase of business as unusual is a good way of capturing what we had today. I also thought we had quite a lot of metaphors. I've heard 3 metaphors, all of which I think capture the situation we're in. The idea that this is a marathon, not a sprint. The Eleanor's plea to remember our own oxygen masks. And the idea that this is whack-a-mole, but that we can all kind of pull off different bits of that puzzle. I think there are 3 main areas perhaps for us to explore. The first is around workforce, and there we've got the idea of avoiding exhaustion, the recasting of teachers and school leaders' roles into a more pastoral one, and the need to kind of manage that potentially through things like rotas as a possible solution. Second one was around resources, and I think we've jumped to the food and the tech, but actually sometimes it's even more basic, as we heard. Sometimes it's about pens and papers. So thinking about basic needs and that kind of hierarchy of needs, perhaps, thinking about when schools are issuing resources to families. Liz mentioned the mix of the academic tasks and other activities people can do. We heard about vouchers, we heard about handing out dongles for data. All of those things potentially as solutions and ways of approaching that. And finally, we had the theme of outreach and safeguarding. We heard about some of the challenges foster carers are facing, teachers filling in where there's shortages in social work, and those young people who are on the margins of being identified as being vulnerable. So the importance of triage in there, because actually there's just so much to do. We need to work out what response can be done at each stage, and all those people who submitted comments about RAG ratings and so on being critical. But ultimately it does raise those questions of what's the priority, and I think talking about those short, medium and long-term focuses, and the fact that what we might be doing in the next few weeks need not necessarily be what we're doing in 6 months' time, but we can only do so much at a time. So I think that idea of the different phases also raises the question of what we do next from this call. So for our part, what we're going to be doing immediately is that Alex is going to be putting together a podcast, kind of summarising some of the discussion. We'll summarise some of the themes that have come out in a paper that can be disseminated. We've had requests from kind of several people in Parliament and so on to have that sort of document already, because they weren't able to join today, but we've got lots of people requesting that. I think we're each individually going to be writing about it, and I'd urge you all to be blogging about this, to be writing pieces for the sector press based on the things that you found most important, because different things will have been important to all of us in this. So carry on the discussion out there. And then we're going to be thinking about whether we need to do some follow-up calls to this, whether we need to reconvene in a few weeks, in a few months, to keep this going and look and sort of try and do a bit of hand-holding through those different phases of a response if possible. I just always with that kind of mindset of we don't have the answers, unfortunately, but we are able to convene you and hopefully bring together some wise ideas and smart approaches. So thank you so much for joining us. It's really very appreciated. And do keep in touch, whether that be by Twitter, by email, however. But if we can do anything to help, tell us how we can be as useful as possible to you. Thank you.